Thank you very much. Slightly different than Build, but it touches on the subject that's in the programme. It's called Demystifying Anti-Semitism, A Return to Critical Theory. This presentation addresses an identifiable need in the study of anti-Semitism that can best be called demystification. Although mystification is present within many traditional accounts, it's also crossed the line to more critical accounts of anti-Semitism. This point becomes clear when we review the trajectory of theories of anti-Semitism over the last 2 centuries. After 1945, or probably more exactly in the 1980s, we see a shift from understanding anti-Semitism as a social phenomenon to understanding its origins as located outside or beyond the social world. In this later phase, anti-Semitism is presented either as a legacy of the past or as something latent, rather as embedded within society and the social relations that comprise it. This shift in understanding of anti-Semitism brings with it a shift in the understanding of society. It implies that if the social conditions for anti-Semitism are lacking, then anti-Semitism is impossible. And that since 1945, the Shoah, those conditions have been resolved. It implies that the Jewish question that has haunted the world since the dawn of the modern age has been resolved. 2 points follow from this observation. First, it presents an ironic inversion of the Nazis' claim to have offered a final solution to the Jewish question. And second, it implies that the full emancipations of Jews and Jewish life within contemporary society has been achieved. In short, it says that the social order of things that gave rise to the real anti-Semitism that emerged in the 18th century and continued or culminated in 1945 is now over. However, I believe that this presumption is premature. In the paper here, I go through these various stages, but I'll just go through it briefly, looking first at an example of the end of or the premature end of anti-Semitism, and then looking back very briefly at the great theorists of the 18th and 19th century, and then conclude very briefly with an example of the so-called anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party. The most recent version of this presentation of anti-Semitism as latent is in Ben Gidley's, McGeever's and Feldman's important paper on the definition of anti-Semitism as a reservoir of negative tropes and images, and here I quote, accumulated over centuries, which exist latently and are deeply embedded in our culture, and that can be replenished over time and from what people draw with ease. In my opinion, 2 problems arise with this approach. The first is the tendency for the understandings of anti-Semitism to mirror the fantasy of anti-Semitism itself. For example, the idea of the latency of anti-Semitism reproduces the myth of the ever-present Jewish malevolence that at any given moment can erupt or spill into the social world. Secondly, there's the problem of anti-Semitism without anti-Semites. This point refers to the idea that anti-Semitism operates, so to speak, behind the backs of social agents. Both of these criticisms lead to a series of important, possibly very important questions. Why and how do social agents access the supposedly latent extra-social realm so as to manifest anti-Semitism? In another section of paper, which I won't have time to discuss, this differs from the great theorists of the 18th and 19th century. For people like Marx was writing, well, let's go back further. Hegel's, for example, philosophy of right can be read in a million ways, but can be read as a conversation or a critical dismissal of the preface in which Fries is mentioned, the anti-Semite populist. Marx, as we know, writes his replies on the Jewish question to what we would now call the anti-Semite Bruno Bauer. Friedrich Nietzsche, in my opinion, one of the best scholars of anti-Semitism, writes against his sister-in-law, his sister and brother-in-law, and of course against, later on in his career, against Richard Wagner. Now, these guys, I know them so I can call them that, these guys, they reject or don't even contemplate of the idea that anti-Semitism is latent or is old-fashioned or is a figment of the past. They're dealing with the anti-Semitism of their own time. They recognize it, in other words, as embedded within the society in which they are writing. However, more recently, there's been now a return to the idea of the social theory or critical theory of anti-Semitism. This is mainly visible, although it's elsewhere, in Robert Fine and Philip Spencer's recent work, Anti-Semitism and the Left on the Return of the Jewish Question. For present purposes, the point I wish to highlight connects with these earlier theorists, the link between anti-Semitism and society. Fine and Spencer identify a dialectic between Jewish emancipation on the one side and the Jewish question understood as the innate negativity and harmfulness of the Jews on the other. They argue that if Jewish emancipation speaks of the universalist rationality of the modern state, then the Jewish question reframes, negates, and restructures the social world around the figure of the Jew. For the Jewish question, as we know, the Jews become the sun around which all else orbits. The ascendancy of the Jewish question over and above that of a Jewish emancipation not only reduces or destroys all social conflicts, but reduces that between anti-Semite and Jew. And in so doing, destroys all the social structures and political structures through which emancipation could even be thought. The point here is that Fine and Spencer are emphatic about recognizing that not only is the Jewish question imbricated, or to use their word, doesn't matter what word they use, within the mundane world of social relations, which Jewish emancipation is included, but it continues to remain a threat both to Jews and to the social world in which emancipation is thinkable and possible. The Jewish question is as much of the social world, in other words, as Jewish emancipation. The inference, of course, is that until Jewish emancipation is complete, the social ground for the Jewish question, anti-Semitism, remains. It is this dialectic between emancipation and Jewish question that we see played out in the recent anti-Semitism scandal in Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. As we know, the crisis of anti-Semitism emerged when the anti-Semitism that had been present at the margins of the party moved into the centre following Corbyn's election as leader. Yet we have to be slightly more careful. It's probably more accurate to say that the crisis reached its climax when Corbyn's own history, along with those close to him, were challenged on the grounds of anti-Semitism. What basically happens in the Labour Party, and I've only got 2 minutes, I just want to read my conclusion, is that we see a shift from Labour as a party of social relations, social opposition, etc., to a party or large sections of the party organised around anti-Semitism. It moved from a problem of anti-Semitism to a problem of the Jews. And we see within a very short space how quickly we move from rationality to irrationality. If I can just finish my conclusion. I want to draw the existence of a distinction that many of us fail to make in our attempts to understand anti-Semitism, and one that's of the utmost importance for understanding and opposing it. The distinction is between the ways in which the Jewish question is articulated, the forms it takes, and the social conditions or social contradictions that give rise to anti-Semitism that is then expressed in the forms. In other words, the reservoir, for example, is the form. It doesn't explain why and how. We all know the various different forms, Jewish media, etc., and so forth. However, even the plausibility of the idea that the forms in which the Jewish question appears are outside or beyond the realm of mundane social relations, it's latent or it's a legacy, can be called into question. For example, one need only think of Walt and Mearsheimer's work, The Israel Lobby. This wasn't latent, this wasn't hidden, this was produced from within the society at the time, published by a leading publisher. Likewise, it was reviewed in journal after journal, press after press. The point here, of course, is that the forms in which anti-Semitism is articulated, the reservoir, is as much a part of the world in which we live as is the Jewish question itself. My final sentence, what this paper has tried to do, even though I've rushed it, I apologize, has criticized recent accounts of anti-Semitism that have relocated it to an extra or non-social realm. In keeping with the tradition of critical theory, the paper sought to demystify it, to ground it within the contours of the profane social world in which the dialectic of Jewish emancipation and the Jewish question has yet to be resolved. Thank you.